Bismillah. My own introduction to Triple IT's Reform of Education project came through while speaking with leaders of Triple IT, this fine institution here. And most of the people who introduced me to this concept are sitting here in this room with us today. But respect to all of them, it is truly Dr. Jamal who spoke with the most passion, the most energy, and possessed such a wealth of knowledge when it came to reforming education for the betterment of the Muslim world. What I understand is that Triple IT has conducted both formal and informal research to conclude that educational institutions are the sites which are failing to produce new generations of Muslims who think, read, and write across the disciplines from an Islamic worldview. Instead, our graduates from Muslim-majority countries are studying academic content in isolation of an Islamic perspective. Although our colleges and universities are graduating economics, economists, computer scientists, biologists, engineers, or entrepreneurs, they're not studying the Islamic perspective grounded in their academic disciplines. This new generation of students are learning that Islam is a religion that is studied solely in the religious studies departments for those who are undertaking careers in religious leadership. But incorporating this Islamic worldview is greater than simply a cursory review of what the Prophet ﷺ said regarding economics or history or science. And it goes much deeper than just indexing a search in the Quran for topics like science or money or profits. This Islamic worldview compels the student and her or his teacher to conduct academic inquiry from a perspective that's not commonly prioritized in the academic literature. It requires this person of knowledge to place God Almighty and His messengers as primary sources of academic thought. And it requires looking beyond standardization of Western viewpoints to explore Eastern or God-conscious perspectives that prioritize faith, honor, and charity. And it is in this understanding that motivates Triple IT, in my understanding, to advance this cause of reform of education, to place it at its highest potential so that we can raise among us a generation of scholars who are experts in both the foundational content of their discipline and in the Islamic worldview that's associated with that discipline. So for my remarks today, I want to look at the topic of reform of education through the lens of educational leadership. This is the subject of my own research agenda, to study leadership as it appears in educational institutions. So when you use this lens, you begin to question who. Who are the ones responsible for leading this reform of education, this global restructuring of higher education in our Muslim-majority countries? And you also begin to question how. How will leaders direct change within institutions of learning to bring this reform of education? So if we look for a moment at the question who's responsible for leading this reform of education? Like other educational reforms, they're most effective when scholars and practitioners and community stakeholders come together with funders and policymakers to construct systems that reform our educational institutions. So in terms of an Islamic reform of higher education in our Muslim-majority countries, there's a role for scholars of Islam, scholars of education, and scholars of the social sciences to come together to present these evidences for reform. One model that we can use in leadership theories comes from two scholars, Bowman and Deal, where you look at four frames of an organization through four frames to better understand how to describe their leadership, their organizational structure, and therefore be able to chart change. Those four frames are structural, so you look at the structure of the institution, you look at human resources, the people. What is the capacity of the people within that institution? There's a need to look at the political frame. What's the context in which this institution exists? And a symbolic frame. There's cultural artifacts that allow this institution to move forward. And so when we use frames like this that persist in other studies of leadership and organizational change, we can apply these theories to a reform of higher education movement so that we know we're charting a course in a direction that is, inshallah, going to lead to success. The second angle to look at when you look at who is involved in change and in leadership, there's a model called distributed leadership, that comes from a place of education. And in this model, the assumption is that leadership is distributed across an organization. It doesn't just reside within one particular person. I think that this application of leadership is most effective for reforming higher education, because we're not simply looking at raising up one leader among us who's going to reform all the sites of education. We're looking at emboldening everyone in the organization to be able to be agents of change. So you distribute leadership across the organization to involve many people in its reform. And this, in my understanding, more so today being part of this seminar, is exactly the fulfillment of Dr. Jamal's legacy. This concept of bringing together people in order to impassion them and strengthen them so that they can move forward to make change. Now, I'm excited that I was able to be a part of IIIT's conference on reform of higher education from this past spring in Istanbul, Turkey. And that was a great example of bringing together scholars from across the disciplines to comment on an Islamic worldview from the lens of their own respective disciplines. So we saw linguists speak, we saw cultural historians speak, we saw philosophers speak. Of course, we saw scholars from the field of Islamic education speak. And so when you bring all of these different academics together in a room and ask them to look at their respective discipline from an Islamic worldview, we can document that, and that also becomes a tool that we can use to chart the course for further reform of higher education. But just linger for a moment over this question of who. It's not just scholars that need to be involved in this reform of education. We also need to include a wider audience. So one, we have practitioners. We have the people whose actually feet are in the ground. They're dealing with the schools on a day-to-day basis. Those people's priorities need to be highlighted by the academics. We also need to involve the policymakers. These are the ones who are going to sustain reform wherever it takes place so that it can last throughout generations. And these policymakers are often the ones that are in charge of allocating funds in order to sustain that reform of higher education. Which leads me to another group that definitely needs to be involved in this initiative, which are the grant makers. When you look at reform of education in an American context, you may think of the Wallace Foundation or the Ford Foundation. These are large organizations that help grant money to organizations and people to conduct research to further education in our American setting. We need similar organizations like IIIT to take the lead in granting such that researchers and individuals can come together to create these reforms and bring them to a state that they can multiply their effects across our Muslim community. Students must be part of reform. If you look in America today, you see evidences of students that want to be involved in colleges and universities. You just need to look over the ocean today in South Africa and see evidences of students that want to be involved in how their colleges and universities are organized, and so we need to involve the students in any efforts of reform. But most importantly, we need the community. We need the stakeholders, the employers, the people in the streets, the people who are working in the businesses with these graduates that are going to be able to comment on the direction of reform of higher education. But not just looking at the types of people that are involved in a reform of education. My research, my passion is in women. And what I knew that I wanted to contribute to IIIT's efforts of reforming higher education is a reminder that an effort to reform must include women as part of the process. Women need to be included at the very beginning, in the middle, and in processes of sustaining this reform of education. Research confirms that women lead differently than men. It's not just that they lead less than or greater than men, although at another time, in another place, I could argue that women have a different capacity that may be perceived as greater in some circumstances. But at least for the efforts of today, we can simply say that women lead differently than men. And that difference is diversity. And that diversity allows any reform effort to be more effective than just having one unilateral viewpoint or perspective. When you look at our Muslim majority countries, There's been a great deal of effort and advancement to bring women and young girls to a state of being literate. All right, we've had significant literacy growth in our countries. We even have a large number of women that are enrolled in colleges and universities in Muslim-majority countries. Some institutions are claiming that as many as 50% or more of their student body represent women. At some point, you could sit back and say, well, this is great. We've got half the women that are educated in the colleges and universities. But that statistic is a bit misleading because many of the Muslim men from these countries are going overseas to seek their education. So the men who remain in the country, women are having a similar rate of education as those men. And then when you dig in a little bit further, the women who are getting access to college education are the ones who live in urban societies, the ones who have an upper middle class background, and they have access to college education. Now, of those women that do earn their degrees, a smaller number of them have positions in faculty. Smaller number of those faculty members are actually in positions of administrative leadership. So when we're designing systems of reform for higher education, we need to look at how we can bring more women to the table in order to be a part of a reform effort. When you do bring women into this type of an effort, you're likely to observe transformational leadership. This is a type of leadership that involves a sincere commitment of the individual leader to tap into the strength of the individuals within that organization. When women lead, you're likely to bring in new ideas, new perspectives, and new directions. And this newness, this diversity of thought is what is commanded to us through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger. So in an effort to lead towards this reform of education, one that does reflect an Islamic worldview across our institutions, we should bring the capacity of leadership in a manner that's consistent with Islam, bringing together a diversity of leaders from different backgrounds and different areas of scholarship. There is a book called Lean In. It's written by Sheryl Sandberg. She's CEO of one of these tech firms. Her book reminds women to lean in to their situation and take a seat at the table so that we can speak with our voice and influence change around the room and be in positions of leadership. But in order for that to occur, we need to agree on one of two things. Either we need to agree to buy a larger table so that in these reform efforts there will be seats for women so that they can lean in, or we need to agree that some of the people who are sitting around the table will stand up gracefully and allow their seat to be occupied by someone else. Because if women are to be given this place, then we need to simply make a place for them. Now, I may not be the one in this room who's known Dr. Jamal Barzinji the longest, nor the closest. But there is something that I have learned by interacting with him and observing with him that I thought I could share. He's one who led with his whole self. And his whole self, from his head, I'm going to give you some metaphors that had come to me. From his head, he was a visionary. He was always looking forward in a forward motion. He would always ask me, whenever I sat with him, how are things doing? How is the school? What are you doing differently? What do you need? What are you thinking about? He's always looking forward. At the same time, his feet were always on the ground. He was embedded in practicality and realism. He was not simply living his head in the clouds. His eyes and his ears were always engaged with observing. He was always observing and gaining feedback from the people around him. But his hands were fully engaged with everything he did. He was one who worked. He was a leader who was active and was working. And so if we are to take Dr. Jamal's legacy and use it as advice for ourselves in this effort of reform of higher education, let us be engaged with this with our full self so that we can be cognizant of the leaders that we're bringing to the table so that we can truly make this reform a lasting reform, inshallah.
Thank you so much.